Here is a question that sounds almost like a trick question, but isn't. What did humans actually eat before they had fire? The honest answer involves a surprising amount of raw meat, a genuinely impressive variety of insects, several categories of food that would horrify a modern health inspector, and a digestive system that was, by necessity, considerably more robust and considerably less picky than the one you are currently using to process your lunch. Before fire, eating was not the controlled, predictable, relatively safe activity it is today. It was a constant negotiation with raw biology, bacterial risk, mechanical difficulty, and the simple problem of extracting enough calories from foods that had not yet been chemically transformed by heat into something easier to digest. So let us actually walk through what was on the ancient pre-fire menu, why it looked the way it did, and what this reveals about a period of human evolutionary history that gets dramatically less attention than it deserves. Mostly because it happened before the invention of the one technology, cooking, that makes for such a satisfying before and after story. Let us start with the single most important point to establish before anything else. Fire is, in evolutionary terms, an extremely recent addition to the hominin toolkit relative to the deep timeline of our lineage. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Our broader genus, Homo, stretches back close to 3 million years. But the controlled, regular use of fire, not occasional opportunistic use of natural wildfires, but the actual deliberate maintenance and use of fire as a routine technology, appears to have become widespread and consistent somewhere in the range of 400,000 to 1 million years ago, with some evidence suggesting earlier sporadic use but genuine debate over how routine and widespread that early use actually was. This means that for an enormous stretch of hominin evolutionary history, stretching back millions of years before any consistent fire use, our ancestors were eating an entirely raw diet, and were doing so not as some kind of survivalist novelty, but as the only available option, generation after generation after generation. Let us begin with meat, because meat consumption is one of the most heavily discussed and most consequential dietary shifts in the entire hominin evolutionary record, and it happened long before fire entered the picture. The archaeological evidence for meat consumption among early hominins predates controlled fire use by an enormous margin. Cut marks on animal bones, produced by stone tools used to butcher carcasses, appear in the archaeological record at sites dating back at least 2.5 million years, and some evidence pushes this date even earlier. This means hominins were eating meat, raw meat by definition, since fire was not yet in routine use, for well over a million years before they had any way to cook it. What did raw meat consumption actually involve, practically speaking? The honest answer is that it involved considerably more chewing than modern humans are accustomed to, a genuine and persistent risk of parasitic and bacterial infection, and a digestive system specifically adapted to handle these challenges in ways that modern human digestive systems, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of cooked food consumption, have partially lost. Raw meat is mechanically tough. Muscle fibers, connective tissue, and cartilage in uncooked meat require significantly more chewing force and significantly more time to break down into swallowable portions compared to cooked meat, where heat has already begun the process of breaking down collagen and softening muscle fiber structure. This is part of why early hominin skulls show such robust jaw musculature and such large molars relative to modern humans. The mechanical demands of processing raw, tough food required genuinely powerful chewing apparatus that later softened, anatomically, as cooking gradually reduced these mechanical demands. The bacterial and parasitic risk associated with raw meat consumption was genuinely significant. Modern food safety guidelines exist precisely because raw and undercooked meat carries meaningful risk of pathogens, including various salmonella strains, E. coli, listeria, and numerous parasitic organisms, all of which are substantially reduced or eliminated by adequate cooking temperatures. Early hominins eating raw meat were exposed to all of these risks without any of the modern interventions that mitigate these dangers today. This raises an obvious and genuinely interesting question: how did early hominins survive this level of exposure to foodborne pathogens for millions of years? The answer appears to involve hominin gut physiology, including stomach acidity levels, being somewhat more aggressive in its pathogen-killing capacity than is strictly necessary for a cooked food diet, providing a buffer against the elevated pathogen load of raw food consumption. Second, and this deserves real emphasis, hominins almost certainly suffered genuinely significant rates of illness and mortality directly attributable to raw food consumption, and simply survived this burden as one of many mortality risks in an environment already characterized by extraordinarily high background mortality from numerous other sources. Beyond raw meat, early hominins almost certainly consumed organ meats with particular enthusiasm. Organ meats, liver, kidney, brain, marrow, are considerably softer and more mechanically tractable than muscle tissue, requiring far less chewing effort to consume raw, while simultaneously offering extremely high concentrations of specific nutrients. Bone marrow deserves particular attention, because the archaeological evidence for marrow extraction among early hominins is genuinely extensive. Many cut marks and percussion marks found on ancient animal bones are specifically consistent with deliberate bone breaking intended to access the marrow cavity. Marrow is essentially pure fat, calorically dense, and would have represented an extremely efficient source of concentrated calories for a species working with a raw, unprocessed food supply. There is also a genuinely interesting strategic dimension to early hominin meat acquisition, because a substantial body of evidence suggests early hominins, particularly in the earlier phases of the genus Homo, may have relied significantly on scavenging, accessing carcasses that had already been killed by other predators. This scavenging strategy has specific implications for what was actually being eaten, since scavenged carcasses range from relatively fresh to genuinely well into the process of decomposition. Many scavenging species, including hyenas and vultures, regularly consume meat well into advanced stages of decomposition without apparent harm, and the practical reality of a scavenging-dependent diet almost certainly meant that at least some portion of the meat being consumed was considerably less fresh than what any modern person would willingly eat. Now let us turn to the plant side of the pre-fire diet, because plant foods almost certainly represented the bulk of caloric intake for most hominin populations across most of this evolutionary period. The specific challenge with raw plant consumption involves the digestibility of starch. Many of the most calorically dense plant foods available to early hominins, tubers, roots, and various underground storage organs, contain starch in a form that is significantly more difficult for the human digestive system to break down when raw compared to when cooked. Raw starch exists in a crystalline structure that human digestive enzymes have considerable difficulty accessing efficiently. Cooking disrupts this crystalline structure through gelatinization, in which heat and moisture cause starch granules to swell and rupture, exposing far more surface area to digestive enzymes. Studies comparing the caloric yield of raw versus cooked starchy foods have found substantial differences, with a meaningful percentage of raw starch passing through the human digestive system essentially undigested. This raises an interesting evolutionary puzzle that researchers including Richard Wrangham have spent considerable effort addressing. If raw, starchy tubers provided meaningfully reduced caloric value, how did early hominins extract sufficient calories from plant sources before fire made this problem easier? Several mechanisms appear to have been involved. First, mechanical processing short of actual cooking does provide some genuine benefit. Pounding, mashing, and thorough chewing increases surface area exposed to digestive enzymes. Second, fermentation, whether deliberately managed or simply an inevitable consequence of plant foods left in warm conditions, provides another mechanism for improving digestibility without fire. Third, and perhaps most important, early hominins almost certainly relied more heavily on plant foods that did not present the same raw starch digestibility problem. Fruits, when ripe, contain sugars in forms directly absorbable without enzymatic breakdown, and nuts and seeds contain fats and proteins that do not face the same digestibility gap. This suggests the pre-fire hominin diet likely emphasized fruits, nuts, seeds, and leafy plant material more heavily relative to starchy tubers and roots than the post-fire diet eventually did, with tubers and roots becoming dramatically more nutritionally valuable specifically after cooking became routine and reliable. There is also the matter of insects, which deserves more attention in popular discussions of ancient hominin diet than it typically receives. Insects represented an extremely accessible, reliable, and nutritionally dense food source that required no cooking to be both palatable and nutritionally valuable. Comparative studies of contemporary great apes, particularly chimpanzees, document extensive and sophisticated insect foraging behavior, including the use of tools to extract termites and ants from their nests. Termites, ants, grubs, and various beetle larvae would have represented a reliable, year-round, easily accessible source of fat and protein that required no fire and relatively modest foraging effort relative to the caloric return. Honey deserves specific mention as well because it represents one of the most calorically dense and most immediately accessible food sources available, requiring absolutely no processing to be consumed and digested with full efficiency. The challenge with honey was not digestibility, but acquisition, given that wild honey is typically defended by bees in ways that make extraction genuinely risky. There is a specific anatomical line of evidence worth exploring in more depth, because the human digestive tract itself preserves a kind of physical record of this entire dietary transition. The human gastrointestinal tract is, relative to body size, notably smaller than that of our closest living primate relatives, particularly when comparing the relative size of the colon. This reduction in human gut size is widely interpreted as a direct consequence of cooking, on the logic that a smaller gut became metabolically viable once cooking began reliably pre-processing food in ways that reduced the digestive workload previously handled by gut tissue itself. This connects directly to one of the more compelling arguments in the broader scientific literature about human brain evolution, sometimes referred to as the expensive tissue hypothesis, developed by researchers including Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler. The core argument holds that the human brain's unusually large size was made metabolically possible specifically because the human gut shrank in compensation, freeing up the substantial metabolic budget that a larger ape-like gut would otherwise have consumed. If this argument holds, a hominin population still relying on a larger, more ape-like gut to extract sufficient energy from a raw diet would have been operating under genuinely tighter metabolic constraints on brain size than later hominins who had access to cooking. Let us also consider dental evidence, because microwear analysis, the study of microscopic scratches and pits on tooth enamel, has been applied extensively to early hominin fossil teeth, and the results consistently support a diet involving substantial mechanical processing demands consistent with raw, tough, fibrous food. Not all early hominins show identical wear patterns, suggesting genuine dietary specialization even within the broader category of pre-fire raw diet consumption. Some early hominin species, particularly within the genus Paranthropus, show dental and jaw morphology suggesting specialization toward extremely tough, fibrous plant material requiring exceptional mechanical processing capacity. Other early Homo species show somewhat less extreme dental specialization, consistent with a more varied and more behaviorally flexible diet. This dietary divergence across different hominin lineages is itself fascinating because it suggests the pre-fire diet was never a single, uniform strategy practiced identically across every hominin. Population. Some specialize toward extreme mechanical processing capacity for tough plant material. Others, including the lineage that eventually led to modern humans, appear to have pursued a more flexible, behaviorally adaptable strategy relying more heavily on behavioral flexibility, tool use, and strategic food choice than on extreme anatomical specialization. There is also a comparative dimension worth exploring involving contemporary individuals who have, for various reasons, maintained substantially raw diets in the modern era. Studies of contemporary individuals following strict raw food diets have found measurable differences compared to individuals eating a typical cooked diet, including lower body mass index and, in women specifically, increased rates of amenorrhea, generally attributed to insufficient caloric intake given the documented reduction in caloric extraction efficiency from raw food. This comparative modern evidence reinforces that the pre-fire hominin diet was not some kind of secretly superior, naturally optimized strategy that modern humans have unfortunately abandoned. It was a genuinely more difficult, more costly, more risk-laden dietary strategy that hominins persisted with for millions of years, because it was the only option available before fire provided a dramatically better alternative. There is one more strand worth pulling concerning seasonal and geographic variation in the pre-fire diet. Hominin populations spreading across Africa and eventually other continents would have encountered enormously varied environments, each presenting a genuinely different mix of available raw food resources. In tropical forest environments, fruit and insect availability would have been relatively consistent across much of the year. Savanna environments would have presented considerably more dramatic seasonal variation, with dry season scarcity making meat and underground storage organs proportionally more important precisely because they remained available even when more easily digestible plant resources had become scarce. This seasonal and geographic variation suggests the pre-fire diet required hominin populations to shift their relative reliance on different food categories depending on local conditions, demanding accumulated environmental knowledge and strategic decision-making capacity. Some researchers have argued these cognitive demands may themselves have contributed to selective pressure favoring increased cognitive capacity in early hominin populations, independent of and prior to the additional cognitive benefits that cooking would eventually provide. The hominin lineage that eventually produced modern humans did not survive by having any single overwhelming anatomical advantage over other species. Early hominins were not particularly fast, particularly strong, or particularly well defended against predators. What they appear to have had, consistently, was behavioral flexibility. The capacity to strategically assess available resources, use simple tools to overcome processing challenges, shift dietary strategy in response to variation, and tolerate genuine costs and risks that a less behaviorally sophisticated species might not have managed. The pre-fire diet, in this light, was not simply a difficult chapter that hominins endured before the real story began. It was itself an essential part of that story, a multi-million-year proving ground during which the behavioral and cognitive flexibility that would eventually define our entire species was being tested and selected for. One raw meal, one foraged tuber, one scavenged carcass, and one handful of insects at a time. There is a genuinely underexplored dimension of this entire story worth bringing in now, and it concerns water, which sounds like an odd thing to dwell on in a discussion of food, but which connects directly and importantly to the broader question of what pre-fire hominin survival actually required, and how tightly interconnected the various survival challenges of this period genuinely were. Fire, once it became available, did not just transform food. It also transformed water safety in ways that are easy to overlook when thinking specifically about diet, but that matter enormously when reconstructing the full survival context that pre-fire hominins were operating within. Boiling water kills the vast majority of waterborne pathogens, including various bacteria, protozoa, and parasites that would otherwise pose genuine and ongoing health risks to anyone drinking from natural water sources. Before fire, hominins drinking from rivers, streams, ponds, and other natural water sources had no equivalent mechanism for reducing this pathogen load, meaning that waterborne illness, alongside the foodborne illness risks already discussed at length, would have represented a persistent and unavoidable background health risk throughout this entire period. This matters for our broader picture because it suggests the pre-fire hominin health burden was not limited to food-specific risks alone. It extended across essentially every category of ingested substance, food, and water alike, creating a genuinely demanding overall disease environment that early hominin populations had to survive within. Generation after generation, using nothing but whatever innate physiological resilience and behavioral risk avoidance strategies they had managed to develop. Choosing water sources carefully, based on accumulated experiential knowledge about which sources tended to produce illness and which did not, would have represented another genuine cognitive and behavioral demand, layered on top of everything else we have already discussed regarding food acquisition and processing strategy. Let us also spend a moment considering the specific question of food storage and preservation in the pre-fire period, because this is another dimension of pre-fire survival that connects directly to dietary strategy, and that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives in popular discussions focused primarily on what specific foods were eaten, rather than how those foods were managed over time. Without fire, and specifically without the smoking and drying techniques that fire eventually made possible, pre-fire hominins had genuinely limited options for preserving food beyond its natural shelf life. Meat from a large kill or scavenged carcass would have begun decomposing relatively quickly, particularly in warm climates, creating real pressure to consume available meat resources rapidly, rather than attempting to preserve them for later use. This time pressure almost certainly shaped hominin social behavior around large food acquisitions in genuinely significant ways, likely contributing to the kind of immediate, group-wide meat sharing that has been extensively documented in studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, and that appears, based on various lines of archaeological evidence, to have deep roots extending back into this much earlier pre-fire period as well. The logic here is fairly direct. If a large kill cannot be effectively preserved and will simply rot if not consumed promptly, the optimal strategy becomes rapid, wide distribution and consumption of the available meat across as many individuals as possible, both to avoid waste and to build the kind of reciprocal social relationships and obligations that would prove valuable when the sharing roles eventually reversed, with a different individual or family group becoming the temporary holder of a large kill on some future occasion. This kind of reciprocal meat-sharing behavior, well documented in modern hunter-gatherer ethnography, may have origins that predate fire entirely, driven initially by the simple preservation problem that an undried, unsmoked piece of meat presents in a warm climate without refrigeration or any other preservation technology. Plant foods presented somewhat different storage challenges depending on the specific food category involved. Nuts and seeds, with their naturally low moisture content and protective shells or husks, would have been considerably easier to store for extended periods without active preservation technology compared to meat, fruit, or tubers, all of which have higher moisture content and correspondingly faster spoilage timelines under most environmental conditions. This differential storability may have given nuts and seeds a particular strategic value in the pre-fire hominin diet beyond their straightforward nutritional content, functioning as a more reliable buffer food resource that could be gathered during periods of abundance and consumed gradually over an extended period, in a way that more perishable food categories simply could not support. Tubers and roots, interestingly, occupy an intermediate position in this storage discussion, because many tuber species have evolved their own natural storage capacity as underground plant organs specifically adapted to survive dormant periods, meaning some tuber varieties can remain viable and edible in the ground for extended periods without requiring any active preservation effort from hominin foragers at all. This natural storage capacity, combined with the simple strategy of leaving tubers in the ground until needed rather than harvesting them all at once, would have provided early hominins with a genuinely useful natural food bank accessible across an extended period without requiring any of the active preservation technology that fire would eventually provide for other food categories. There is also a genuinely interesting comparative angle worth bringing into this discussion involving contemporary chimpanzee dietary behavior, because chimpanzees represent our closest living relatives and offer at least some imperfect but genuinely informative window into what a sophisticated raw food primate diet can actually look like in practice, observed directly by researchers in real time rather than reconstructed indirectly from fossil and archaeological evidence alone. Extensive long-term field studies of wild chimpanzee populations, conducted across multiple research sites in Africa over several decades, have documented an extraordinarily varied diet, incorporating well over 100 distinct plant species at some study sites, supplemented by insects, by opportunistic meat consumption through both scavenging and active hunting of smaller animals, and by careful seasonal tracking of which specific food resources are available and worth pursuing at any given point in the year. This level of dietary sophistication and behavioral flexibility, documented directly in a living, observable primate species, provides genuinely strong supporting evidence for the broader argument we have been building throughout this discussion, that successfully managing a raw, unprocessed diet across variable environmental conditions requires and reflects genuine behavioral and cognitive sophistication, not simple passive consumption of whatever happens to be available. Chimpanzee hunting behavior specifically deserves additional attention here because it directly illuminates questions about early hominin meat acquisition that the archaeological record alone cannot fully resolve. Researchers have documented chimpanzees engaging in coordinated group hunting of smaller primates, including colobus monkeys, using strategies that involve role differentiation among hunting party members, and that produce meat-sharing patterns among successful hunters and other group members that bear genuine resemblance to patterns documented in human hunter-gatherer societies. If chimpanzees without any access to fire or sophisticated tool technology beyond simple sticks and stones are capable of this level of coordinated hunting behavior and structured meat distribution, it provides reasonable grounds for inferring that early hominins, sharing a relatively recent common ancestor with chimpanzees and possessing at least comparable, and likely somewhat greater, cognitive and behavioral sophistication were capable of broadly similar or more advanced raw meat acquisition strategies well before fire entered the picture. This comparative evidence also helps address a specific question that sometimes gets raised in discussions of pre-fire hominin diet: whether early hominins were primarily passive scavengers, opportunistically consuming whatever carrion happened to be available, or active and capable hunters in their own right, even without fire as a technological aid. The honest answer, based on the combined weight of archaeological cut mark evidence, comparative primate behavioral evidence, and anatomical evidence related to hominin physical capabilities, suggests both strategies were almost certainly employed. Likely with the specific balance between scavenging and active hunting shifting across different hominin species, different time periods, and different specific environmental and ecological circumstances, rather than either strategy operating as the single, exclusive approach throughout this entire extended pre-fire period. Bringing this expanded discussion to a close, what emerges is an even richer and more textured picture of the pre-fire dietary world than we had already established. It was a world defined not just by what specific foods were available and how they were processed and consumed, but by an entire interconnected web of survival challenges, including water safety, food preservation and storage strategy, and the behavioral coordination required to successfully acquire and distribute resources like large game meat that could not be preserved for extended periods without the preservation technology that fire would eventually provide. Every one of these challenges demanded genuine behavioral sophistication and accumulated environmental knowledge, reinforcing the broader theme that has run throughout this entire discussion. The millions of years hominins spent eating without fire were not simply a deprived prelude to the real story of human dietary development. They were themselves a genuinely demanding, genuinely sophisticated chapter of that story, during which the behavioral flexibility, strategic thinking, and accumulated practical knowledge that would eventually define our species were being actively forged, tested, and refined against the genuine and unforgiving constraints that an entirely raw food world imposed.